Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion. It can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of Murdochracy, a podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. There we go. We're in double digits now. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Sami Shah.
Hey, Sammy, have you told any lies this week?
Oh, wow. That's, I'm not known for lying. I think I've never told any lies at all in the history of my life and lying. I believe in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and he always told me never to lie. So I speak in tongues sometimes. I don't know what I'm saying when I speak in tongues, but,
Exactly.
and no one can really decipher that, but maybe that's lies, but I doubt it. Who would lie about speaking in tongues?
Of course. And, the thing is I never lie. I always mean what I say in the heat of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
At that exact moment, that's exactly what I believe. Will I believe it in the future? Did I believe in the past? Well, that's not really important. It's all about the here and now,
Right.
living in the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Life is all about the carpe diem, and I'm copying the DM out of it.
I thought this week, the culmination of COP26, Scott Morrison's net zero plan, which turned out to be not zero, as was revealed by the modeling that came out on Friday. There's still a bunch of it which needs to be figured out. And all of that we've actually kind of entered into a new stage of Scott Morrison's prime ministership, where it seems like people are a lot more willing just to call him a liar. And I actually think that, we don't know what's going to happen next election. It's going to happen next year sometime. And, a lot can happen between now and then. But I do think that if he loses, we will look back at this month of October specifically and be like, that was actually a turning point.
Well, I mean, there was a moment, if you remember, in the 2016 US presidential elections, where it was called the post-truth era. Like, I think it was the word of the year in the dictionary, I remember, in 2016, the post-truth, because the idea being that truth is all relativistic now, and everything we have as what is reality is purely down to personal interpretation of reality and all that stuff. And I think Scott Morrison's been trying to implement that same kind of philosophical approach to facts and fact checking in Australia, and found that maybe Australians aren't as on board with the post-truth era as their American counterparts, perhaps.
I think one of the big things is that we're probably more prepared for it. And, we saw the news media industry go under a lot of transformation and changes in what they believed in, the philosophy, because of the era that was ushered in by Trump and his consistent lying. We're seeing Morrison lie more. This is something that at my current workplace, Crikey, we did a bit about it, and now a lot of other people are kind of, I think, getting on board as well. I think that he's feeling under pressure, and that pressure is leading him to kind of lie more and lean more into this kind of crass, I never said anything bad about electric vehicles. I'm not, you can quote it back to me, but that's not what I said, or I don't believe that I was being rude about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we're better prepared for that, but I also know as well that, when we saw the coverage of this electric vehicle saga, and I think all the media pointed out that this was a big backflip. So, they were straight away calling it out, because in 2019, He said there's a war on the weekend, which was obviously ridiculous, but it was repeated by, sections of the media, including News Corp. We're seeing them be more critical. But then, literally the next day, the government came out with its policy about emissions. It was a climate change policy that was reported as being like $1 billion fund, but the second line of the media release about it was that actually it's only $500 million that we're putting in, and $500 million that other people will put in, business will co-invest, which was, uncritically reported as $1 billion. And, at the end of the day, we don't have to get too much in the details of it. The point was that even though, I feel like the media wanted to make up for the mistakes it had made in the past, because it was pretty embarrassing that people repeated the war on the weekend thing. they were just like all too willing or I guess unaware of the fact that they just made a similar mistake again. Do you think that we're learning the lesson?
Oh, this goes all the way back now to, we're talking about Chomsky's manufacturing consent series, where it's basically the same mistakes being made again and again and again by media, because media thinks in short-term cycles and so can only practice correction in short-term cycles. I don't think we're learning lessons. I think we're going to find out about all the lessons we have learned and whether those lessons have been effective in the next election, which I think the announcement should be soon. All right, let's do this. When the elections are announced, let's you and I make some predictions as to how the media will cover the run-up to the elections, and then let's see if we can kind of create a bingo around that for our listeners to play along with. All right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And look, Sammy, if there's one thing I love doing as a card-carrying member of the media class,
the media elite.
I love manufacturing consent.
Yes.
I do it all day long. I do it I'm paid to do it. I do it in my spare time as well. It's so much fun, convincing the masses to believe the elites. So, speaking of the media, we are speaking this week to, I would say, one of the keenest observers of Australia's media industry, Tim Burrowes. He is the founder of Mumbrella. He has just written a book called The Media Unmade about the 2010s and all the disruption that happened. And especially, he talks a lot about News Corp and Lachlan Murdoch, who seems like he's in a pretty good position to take over the whole thing, had some very interesting sagas in Australian media during the 2010s. So we're chatting to him about that. But before we get into some of our stuff, I also want to say that we have a bunch of new Patreon subscribers who are supporting what we do, and we're very grateful
That's
to
so
them.
lovely. Thank you so much for your patronage. It means the world to us, and it allows us to do this.
Exactly. So thank you to Nick, to Alex, to Ned, and Louise. We're very grateful. If you want to support what we do, you can go onto our Patreon, which is patreon.com/Murdocracy, MURDOCRACY. And support what we do, because we really love doing it. And if we can get support, we can expand what we're doing and be able to put more time into it and to make it really good for you.
Yep, thank you very much.
So, for our News Corp news of the week, our first story is that News Corp Australia posted a $60 million loss on $1.4 billion of revenue last year, according to documents filed with ASIC. Their earnings were actually down $60 million from the year before, but their money from circulation and subscription, which is essentially the money you're getting direct from people who are readers and consuming your content, was up nearly 20% to more than $600 million. Sammy, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, hang on, haven't we just spent the last few weeks talking about how much money that News Corp is making internationally? How is it possible that they are also losing in Australia? Mm-hmm. Well, the reason is that, the first reason is that this is an insight into their Australian operations, but also, with the way that their structure works, this isn't really the full picture. The full picture is what we get from those international filings. This kind of gives us a bit more, insight into some more of the details. But what I thought was really interesting was that for the first time, they are now earning more money directly from their subscribers. So that's people who are paying for their content or paying for, to buy, they're either subscribing or they're picking up a newspaper. They're getting more from there than they are from advertising, which means that, you're seeing this balance shift from being like, well, we care about the people who are putting their stuff in our, in between our content, to now we need to create that direct relationship with the audience. What do you think?
Well, that's been the big, interesting challenge to newspapers and news outlets and news media since the tech boom, really, since the late 90s and early 2000s, where they're trying to balance that trying to balance the losses from advertising revenue that they've incurred with an increase in subscriptions. And no one's really done it successfully to date. We've seen a lot of people, everyone from the New York Times on down, struggling to see the subscriber numbers match their advertising revenue. News Corp seems to have figured that out. My suspicion is it's largely down to the fact that unsubscribing from News Corp is such a nightmarish hellscape that people would much rather just leave the subscription running until they die than actually go through the entire process of calling someone up and begging them to cancel their credit cards. But look, it's also that thing of how they structure the financials, and we shouldn't feel too bad about the losses they're making, because as you mentioned, they did make a huge profit abroad and internationally overall, and I'm sure this is one of those things which is, I'm not making an accusation here. I'm just wondering out loud if this is similar to how every Hollywood studio somehow makes a loss on every movie when it comes tax time.
Yeah, poor Rupert isn't on the breadline anytime soon, so he's not going to be going around. Well, he will be going around and with his cap in hand, but he's doing okay.
He won't have to set up a Patreon, is what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, he probably should anyway.
Yeah.
I hear there's great money in that. Hey, speaking of unsubscribing, friends, we want to call them friends of the pod, The Chaser, actually offer a great service that if you go to them and you put in your details, they will actually unsubscribe to News Corp for you. They will do the hard yards. And so, we appreciate anyone who helps out people like that. So if you are somehow stuck on there, you can't be bothered waiting on hold during office hours, they will help you out. Sammy, can I also ask, just out of curiosity, what generally are you subscribed to? What publications?
So I've got subscription to the Australian, I've got subscription to the Saturday paper, I've got a subscription to the Age. So those are the three papers. Oh, and the New York Times. And then in the streaming services, it's just a bananas shit show in my life. I have Foxtel, I have Netflix, I have Stan, I have Binge, I have what's it called, Disney Plus. So all of those are basically bleeding me dry. The thing is, I need all of these for work. I really genuinely do. I work in a variety of fields and I need them all for work. But the end result has been that I'm just hemorrhaging money all the time.
That's if the tax office is listening.
Yes.
That's why we need to be able to claim them as deductions.
What about yourself?
I am subscribed to a bunch of those newspapers as well, to the Sydney Morning Herald, to a few others. And I also have quite a few individual subscriptions to good writers who are doing things through Substack and Patreon, particularly people over in the US who are doing writing about the internet, which is what I'm particularly interested in. So I, we are moving to a model where you can directly support people, including Murdochracy, or patreon.com/Murdochracy, to do good things, and they don't need to be supported by a full news operation anymore. But just generally, News Corp, it was at the front of convincing people that they shouldn't just get content for free, they should pay for good content. And they are reaping the benefits of that. So the second story that I have is that New South Wales Journalism held its awards night this week called the Kennedys. And one of the awards given out raised at least a few eyebrows. Sky News After Dark host Peta Credlin beat out a star-studded field to win the award for outstanding long-form current affairs for her Sky News investigation, Deadly Decisions, Victoria's hotel quarantine catastrophe. The Guardian's Amanda Meade wrote, given Credlin's well-known animosity to Victoria's pandemic response and lockdown measures, editor's note or my note, because of course she was the chief of staff to former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, many saw the story as an agenda-driven partisan attack on the Victorian Premier Dan Andrews. Sammy, what do you think? Was it well-deserved for this piece of investigative journalism finally calling dictator Dan to account?
Well, I mean, look, previously Peta Credlin won the, the Office of the Order of Australia, one of the Queen's birthday honours, and it's the second highest rank in the honour system as well. So clearly the people who like her really like the work she's doing. It's kind of weird to give an award to someone who at the same time that they reported on the hotel quarantine system also had to issue an apology to the entire South Sudanese community for mislabeling them as being the cause of the COVID-19 spread.
Yeah, a bit of a boo-boo there.
Yeah, so, but there's so many of these awards are just, sometimes they tend to be things for time served. They tend to be, just a pat on the back for doing the hard yards and just turning up to your job every day on time. Journalists have a very low threshold for competence, and and this seems to be one of the things where we're just giving these awards to each other just to be able to say, "Good job, you didn't vomit all over yourself this week."
Well, they are the Bogan Walkleys, as was, for those people who don't get the reference, Michael Rodden, who writes for the Australian Financial Review, won an award, and in his speech, he referred to the Kennedys as the Bogan Walkleys. He was then ushered off the stage. They turned the spotlight off, and then they deleted the tweet from the website announcing his award. And then they also, the list of winners they sent out that night, didn't have him on it as well.
That is remarkably thin-skinned, though.
Incredibly thin-skinned from the industry. I do think, though, you actually raise a very insightful point, which is that in the media industry, we tend to hold up certain people or certain types of media as like award winning. And one of those is this idea of doing long form video journalism. And of course, that is what this award was specifically for. But the funny thing about these awards is that these opportunities to do long form journalism reporting is not given to most people. There are a lot of journalists out there who have not been afforded the same benefits given to Peta Credlin at Sky News, where, as soon as she got into media, she was given a great gig and clearly a lot of a leash by her company to produce something like this. So really, you are competing against actually quite a small field of people. And I guess, that's kind of how these awards work. They give something to people for long form journalism who are already kind of, I guess, like the elite in the elite of the industry. And then that award kind of reaffirms their status. And I guess the thing is, if these opportunities were given to more journalists, if a lot of people out there, think about the country paper journalists who've been spending, years and years slaving away, might have a great story they want to write about. Or think about the other journalists at major publications who just kind of came in the ground floor, weren't the chief of staff to a former prime minister and so didn't get a gig like this. They may also be able to produce high-level stuff, but they're excluded from this because they didn't come in at this level and so could never win an award like this.
Well, it goes down to that Groucho Marx quote, right? Where he said, "I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member." And I guess I'd say the same thing over here. A self-respecting journalist should refuse to take an award from any organization that would give them one, particularly an organization like the Kennedys here.
But if you're listening, I'll absolutely have a Kennedy Award. Please vote for me next year. Is it voting? I don't know.
I have no idea how they actually tabulate these.
So I missed this late last month, but I thought it's worth noting that the Australian marked a decade, 10 years of having a paywall. They were the first Australian major news company to put their content behind a wall on their website only for subscribers, according to the Australian's media editor, James Maiden. I mention this because, we live in a world now where paywalls are everywhere, but at the time it was a really foreign idea. And as it turns out on this one, News Corp was really right. They stubbornly led the way on telling people that their content is going to be paid for online. In the early part of this decade or of the 2010s or even, the decade before, towards the end of it, the internet had exploded. People were using it. A lot of people were getting their news online, but no one had really cracked at how to get people to pay for it. They were doing ad-supported stuff, which has turned out to be a pretty flawed business model. They really did lead the way. And I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Almost everyone is doing paywalls now. I think that this is actually something that, in an incredible way, is actually an achievement of the company. And, you can obviously say it's self-serving, but I think it's also shown that people, it's about creating the culture that people should pay for content. And by doing that, it is, I think, given a bit of a life raft to the industry, don't you think?
Absolutely, it's been they were able to ride out that change in human thinking. We went from a time where you paid for things you like to a time when, in the advent of the internet and everything, where we all developed the attitude of, if it's worth having, I should have it for free. Which is where you saw piracy and Kazaa and Napster and all these things kind of coming around, and newspapers just giving away their content for free as well. And News Corp in this situation just basically said, no, if our work is worth paying for, and if you want it, you have to pay for it. And people eventually did come around to that. Now we're at that golden era, it seems, of people being happy to pay for content that they enjoy, whether that be to the individual or to the organization. And, kudos to them for sticking it out, because many people blinked in the face of the hurricane. So them not doing so, it required a certain amount of, obviously, financial fortitude, which they have the ability to do, but also just overall, there must have been internal pressure as well to get rid of the paywall that they ignored.
There was a part in the article that I thought was pretty interesting. 59% of the digital subscribers to the Australian in 2011 were the over 55 male executive category. Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
But today, the subscriber base is more reflective. This is according to James Madden, the Australian's media writer, but we'll take it with a grain of salt. But with 32% of readers aged over 55, so that's halved what it was before, and 30% under 35. That surprised me.
That is interesting. I wonder how much of that is down to the Weekend Australian, because they do a really good job with that magazine. It just has a really good arts coverage. And I wonder how much of that comes from there, and how much of that comes from just, overall the rise that we've seen in people critical of liberal politics, or leftist politics rather, in, with the young cohort on social media and YouTube and stuff, and the Australian kind of catering to that voice.
Yeah, owning the left by subscribing to the Australian
Yes.
may be a natural strategy. And final one for this week, Sammy. And I know you've been waiting so long for this, but if you could just hold your excitement.
All right, bring it.
News Corp is looking to start, or is about to start, a new platform purely for long-form sports writing.
No.
Now, this is
that didn't go where I thought it would go.
You did a great job of holding your excitement. Lifting from The Athletic, which is an international sports-only publication that's really blown up in the last few years, Zoe Samias from Nine Papers reports that this new publication called The Code is expected to launch next week and will be separate from their existing sports reporting. It's going to have a lot of in-depth articles about Australian stars, both in Australia, but Australian stars also overseas. Sammy, this is probably a stupid question, but I'm assuming you're going to sign up for it, right?
Oh, that's a given. Absolutely. Let me give you my relationship with sports. Pakistan and Australia apparently fought against each other in the T20 World Cup a couple of days ago. I had no idea. I woke up in the morning to find hundreds of text messages from my family and friends in Pakistan cursing me out for being an Australian. I had to go online to look at exactly what they were angry about, so that Australia beat Pakistan in the match. And then I went online and claimed that I love Australia so much and Pakistanis should learn how to play cricket better if they care about the sport, while not really giving a damn, not knowing a single member of either team that I could name off the top of my head. So yeah, it's purely for owning the libs is why I love the sport.
Totally. When it suits me, I'll pay attention to it. I love being a winner, but when I'm not, now.
So do you barrack for a footy team?
I kind of support the Greater Western Sydney Giants in the AFL. I'm not really an NRL guy, but I've gotten a lot into basketball, but international basketball.
Right.
So the NBA.
Oh yeah, I've noticed that on your Twitter feed. It's very strange.
Yeah. No, it's good. Actually, do you know, I think, most modern sports coverage is really kind of soap opera kind of stuff. Like, you know, it's knowing the ins and outs of what's happening in the players' lives. It very much is kind of like gossip mags for men. I know that's kind of being stereotypical, but it totally is. And like, you know, you'll see traditional guys being like, oh, I don't really care about celebrity goss. But then they'll be talking about, oh, like Kyrie Irving hasn't got his vaccine, and I wonder what's going to happen. And did you see that Ben Simmons broke up with, you know, whoever? So I quite enjoy the NBA. I think it's great content. You barely even, you know, in fact, the modern sports product is so much that they've gotten it so good, you know, the whole ecosystem of highlights of people aggregating and sharing clips on social media. You can be an NBA fan and not actually watch any NBA. That's how good they are about it. It's become so distant actually from the product itself. Will I be signing up for code? Probably not, but I guess, you know, the whole point with these things is just expanding the amount that existing customers are I think are paying. And so you've got, you know, KO, people are already paying a certain amount from that. And then they'll be like, well, you know, I know that they can, you know, News Corp can advertise to their subscriber base who already exists, who they have there, who love sport, who they know will shell out for it. And they can be like, oh, you really want to read this article with, you know, new NBA player from Australia, Josh Giddey. It's a great article, long read. No one else has it, but you got to shell out another $10 a month. And a lot of them will just say, oh, yeah, easy. It's about, you know, you can, you know, in business, you can either find new audiences or you can expand the ones that you currently have into paying for more. To me, this is a play at getting more money from their existing customers.
Yes. And it's time for Good News Corp, Bad News Corp. Although this week, I think I might have only two Good News Corps. Not to say that there wasn't any Bad News Corp. I'm sure there was, but there's two Good News Corp stories I wanted to share. I thought, you know...
We're feeling positive this week.
That's right. The first Good News Corp story is, of course, congratulations, a massive congratulations to Samantha Maiden, journalist for News Corp Australia, who was awarded the $25,000 Bogan Walkley Prize for Journalist of the Year. And she also took home awards for Outstanding Investigative Journalism, the Rebecca Wilson Award for Scoop of the Year, and Outstanding Political Reporting. So that's quite a few awards for one person representing News Corp in the award ceremony. Good. So well done, Samantha.
Sam Maiden is a journalist who I'm very jealous of. I'm professionally jealous all the time. I think that's the way with a lot of journalists. I'm just constantly jealous of other people's great work, and her award. I'm not jealous of her because of the award. I'm jealous of her because of her incredible reporting. And so, congratulations, Sam. I wish I had your skills.
Richly deserved, absolutely. The other story rather that I have found a lot of inspiration from is, and this is on news.com.au. I was furiously looking through the website for a bad News Corp example, and I was like, this is too good to pass up. It is a good News Corp story as well, and it is by Natalie Brown, journalist writing for their lifestyle segment, and it says Aldi selling cult favorite lobster tails for $29. Now, Cam, I ask you, have you had the lobster tails from Aldi?
I have not, and this will be controversial for a media elite from my left ivory tower where I'm sipping lattes and eating quinoa. Lobsters, not really a fan.
Look, I get it. I know a lot of people who have slowly come around to the realization that lobsters used to be prison food for a reason back in 17th century France, and maybe they need to return back to that. But I will make an argument for the Aldi lobster tail because it's look, I've had it more than once. All right, it's got garlic butter glaze. It's got really nice kind of seasoning with butter, garlic, lemon juice, parsley, and salt, and you also can combine that with, if you really want to feel gluttonous, the goose fat crispy roasting potatoes from Aldi. All of this, by the way, is on their news story. The entire news story is just an ad for Aldi. But as a fan of Aldi's frozen food section, this is news that I needed. I don't care about, so many of the... Let's go to the front page of news.com.au. Okay, I don't care that Peter Hellier has COVID. Couldn't give a shit, really. I don't care about Paris Hilton's lavish 3-day wedding, nor do I care about an ex-army worker's incredible transformation or Meghan's 3-word dig at the Queen. What I care about is that the lobster tails are back at Aldi, and News Corp just told me that, so thank you, news.com.au.
Peter, hell yeah, get
Get
well
well
soon.
soon.
Yeah. And I guess kind of ironically, this has turned into an ad for Aldi as well.
Yes,
So thank you for
inadvertently.
the bit of spawn cod. Hey, I actually do have a late recommendation or nomination for Bad News.
All right,
Corp.
bring it.
Sammy, did you see this week that Pauline Hanson debuted some political cartoons that were meant to be satire? Did you see those?
So I saw them on social media in excerpts. I didn't see the whole thing, but I saw excerpts on social media, and I thought they were parodies of someone trying to make political cartoons, not realizing that they were sincerely that bad. Can you please describe them?
So they are in a South Park style, which is how they're sold. Apparently, they're releasing 20 2-minute episodes. They've released 2 so far. And what they are is they have Pauline Hanson as this kind of patient, reasonable teacher who's overseeing a classroom of Australian politicians who are all in some ways, kind of caricatures and represented as kind of negative. So ScoMo is a kind of like bogan dickhead. Albo's a kind of rat. Peter Dunn is actually, I think this is very funny, is portrayed as Voldemort, which is quite good. and I think it's, it was written to appeal to that they said this is for a youth audience. And I'm kind of skeptical whether it will appeal to that, because I think you have to be already pretty politically engaged to actually make sense of all the characters. Like they have, like some bits of it are actually, you hate to say it, but are quite funny. Other parts are not so great. Like there's a gay joke between, like a kind of gross one between Albo and Adam Band and other stuff like that. Like, I mean, this is not like, I hate to give it to her, but actually this is very funny. I also think that it portrays Pauline Hanson as much more, reasonable and cogent than she actually is, which is probably to her benefit as well.
So that means in satire, a satirical version of Pauline Hanson is more reasonable and cogent than the real version of Pauline Hanson.
Yeah. When you put it like that, I think that is actually quite funny. The reason that it's in this category is Rita Panahi, who is a columnist for News Corp, is a host on Sky News Australia. She thought it's genuinely funny. I think that's probably a little bit too beneficial, or a little bit too. I think that probably gives a little bit too much credit to the video. Corey Bernardi, another Sky News host, said, "I'm liking this. This is a promotion sent out by Pauline Hanson about people who have vouched for it." My take on it is that there was a lot of people in a tizzy being like, "Oh my god, is this gonna convince all these young people to vote for Pauline Hanson?" I actually think because it relies so much on like political know-how, that anyone who doesn't already know that, who isn't already an engaged voter, and if they are an engaged voter, they already have an opinion on Pauline. If they don't, like, they probably aren't going to get it. And I think it's kind of shown. It's done well on Facebook, but not crazy better than her other stuff. It's actually kind of bombed on TikTok, because I think it actually appeals to boomers more than anything else.
Well, that's the thing. It does it. That's my question to you. I suppose, having seen it in greater detail than I have, do you think it'll go off with the intended audience?
I think so. I think that, like, a lot of the people sharing it have been people who are not going to vote for Pauline Hanson, but being like, oh, bits of this are funny, or even the kind of alarm shares. I think, like, particularly people who is like, I think there's a lot of people on the left who live in constant fear that, like, people on the right are kind of smarter and savvier politicians, or more cutthroat or whatever than the left, and doing something like this, it's going to work. I think if, for instance, the Labour or the Greens put this out, people will be like, this is, like, really cringe. I think they kind of get the benefit of the doubt that they're like, they're smart and they figure this all out. I don't really think anyone's going to change their mind. We'll see. There's 20 videos in total, but I think from the kind of, the metrics that they set up, the kind of goals that they set, which is, this is going to appeal to young people. I've mostly seen it, like, shared by older people. It didn't go well on TikTok as well. I don't think we need to worry about a whole generation of young people being pilled by Pauline Hanson into voting for One Nation.
Yet. She still hasn't cracked the formula, but she's clearly got brains working on it.
It seems like she might have won the support of Rita Panahi, who says, so that is the bad
Youth
news.
Influencer Rita Panahi.
Yeah. Tim Burrowes Burrowes founded Mumbrella, one of Australia's major media publications, in 2008. And over the next decade, he saw an incredible time of change, morphing and growing in the Australian media scene, including the continued dominance of News Corp. Earlier this year, he published Media Unmade, Australia's most disruptive decade, great name, and now writes a very insightful newsletter under a similar name, Unmade. He joins us now to talk, to break down a few of the questions that we've got about News Corp financials, and to give us some insight into what News Corp was like and the Murdochs over that decade. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey Cam, hey Sammy, thank you so much for the invitation.
First of all, I want to ask, pick your brain, because you're probably the best person to ask this. We've talked a bit about how News Corp International has been really going gangbusters financially over the last year. Things are looking very good. But then this week, we got a rare insight into News Corp Australia's finances, because they filed some papers with ASIC that said that they had been suffering, I think it was a $60 million loss over the last year. That was actually down from the year before. Of course, a lot of COVID expenses. I guess I wanted to understand, place that in context. Is this just as simple as the Australian arm being a loss maker for News Corp International, or is there something a bit more complicated going on here?
I think I would lean towards the second, which is News Corp has always been a complicated organisation structurally, and probably more so now than ever, in that broadly it's an organisation which looks towards the US, the UK, and Australia, particularly when it comes to its kind of news operations, but also increasingly its financial fortunes depend on more than just its news mastheads. So book publishing, real estate, and that particularly means the kind of digital real estate side of things. What it calls its Dow Jones unit, which is kind of Wall Street Journal plus financial information, and then of course news media. So there are different speeds there, and then alongside that, particularly in Australia, is the division that it calls subscription video services, but we would think of as the Foxtel group. So the kind of subscription broadcast, sort of old school Foxtel, and then the video streaming services alongside it. And they all contribute to the picture. And of course, they all tend to react differently to what's going on in the economy, and all tend to move at a different speed. So it's always really hard to at any given time have a full picture about just how the organisation is travelling.
One of the things that a lot of people have reported around this job loss, or the earnings losses that News Corp kind of posted, is that it's because of the pandemic. But when you look at the thing, viewership numbers seem to have gone up during the pandemic. The social media numbers definitely went up during the pandemic. We know digital subscriptions have gone up during the pandemic. How does that turn into a loss when it seems by all metrics that they're doing better right now? Is this one of those situations where, in Hollywood, every movie makes a loss so they don't have to pay taxes?
A few things went on kind of during the pandemic and over the last 18 months or so, of which the biggest single impact was News Corp shutting a lot of its community and local newspapers. Now that was clearly in response to what they saw as the health of that division. Some of them went digital only, others went away altogether. And that was really down to two things. It was a real fall off in advertising. Now, some of that is just because advertising has tended to move away from newspapers generally, and some of it was accelerated by the effects of the kind of COVID downturn, which just hurt newspapers generally. Not just the News Corp papers, but out west, the Seven West media newspapers, and then of course the former Fairfax papers, now owned by Nine. So that was a major factor, and that there is that irony. There might be an appetite for news, but that doesn't automatically mean that that it is as profitable if the advertisers aren't there. And then of course what you're relying on is subscription revenue. And in fairness to News Corp over the last decade or so, it's done a good job, better than many people expected, in beginning to put on paying digital subscribers. But it's a slog, and it feels that the public are generally harder to persuade to sign up for news subscriptions than they are for video streaming subscriptions, for instance.
One thing that I have been, I've noticed is that News Corp traditionally has for a long time been the one saying, we will get you to pay for our digital content. This, at the start of the decade in particular, news companies were really starting to be like, okay, there's a lot of stuff happening on digital, but, how are we going to make money off it? And, for a long time, I think the impulse was to make things free and to try figure out other ways of making money through things like advertising. But News Corp really has for a long time kind of stood steadfast in its commitment to being like, you guys are going to pay for it. And that kind of came with the paywall, which the Australian recently celebrated, which is a funny term, I guess, but celebrated 10 years of having a paywall. And they said that they were the first in Australia. And then, of course, the recently, I guess, resolved fight between Google, Facebook, and Australian media companies with the News Media Bargaining Code, where, they got the tech giants to cough up to have their content on the platform, something that people for a long time said was kind of a kind of a folly. What do you think that says about the strength of News Corp as a company and their ability to, I guess, draw, make people pay for things?
Look, strength of will comes into it. It really does, because, as you allude to there, when maybe a dozen years or even a little bit more ago, Rupert Murdoch first began to talk about people paying for digital content and first began to talk about the digital platforms effectively needing to pay for the right to link. Those were both quite out there ideas at the time. It was no certainty that it would work, and yet it has. Particularly I think on the kind of the broadsheet side of things. So, there were some numbers when the News Corp's annual report came out about a fortnight or so ago. The Australian now up to almost 250,000 paying subscribers, which is a really impressive number, and it's
pretty significant, yeah.
The number's not quite as big when it comes to the kind of the tabloids. So, the Telegraph in Sydney, the Herald Sun in Melbourne, the Courier Mail, all had very similar numbers of just under 150,000 each, and then the Advertiser in Adelaide a bit lower again, but not insignificant numbers. And they absolutely played into that theme that for news mastheads to kind of survive in the new world, the new digital world, it would absolutely have to be about subscribers paying first and then some advertising, rather than the other way around. So that was definitely one part of it. And then the other, as you say, was this going after the digital platforms and asking them to, effectively pay to be in that space, was again, a triumph, not just of making the argument, but the influence, because of course it took the ACCC and the direction of Scott Morrison's government to make it happen to the benefit of the big traditional media owners in Australia. And I rather suspect that an awful lot of that was the influence that News Corp holds politically that made that a kind of palatable thing for the government to do.
How successful has this whole shift to subscription first, advertiser second been in other parts of the world? In America, for example, is this a thing that News Corp can copy the American model in Australia and see it as just as profitable, or is Australia have different metrics when it comes to just overall subscription advertising and therefore market earnings?
Look, I think in fairness to News Corp, it's probably been one of the global leaders, certainly when the Australian jumped a decade ago. So, there would be a handful of examples people use from around the world of that sort of subscriber or user pay. So people talk a lot about the New York Times, for instance. So that's globally is probably the best example. And then, when you look at other examples, you might talk about the success of the Guardian for persuading readers to pay, but it's a slightly more philanthropic model in that they're asked to do it kind of out of the goodness of their hearts, I suppose, to support that sort of journalism, rather than that straight transaction of, if you want to read it, you've got to pay for it. So I actually think that when it comes to subscription marketing, it's probably more often than not that other markets are looking towards what News Corp has done in Australia rather than the other way round.
Getting people, world leaders, and getting people to cough up. I love that. Now, Tim, I want to ask you about, let's kind of turn to what you cover in your book. And can you just first give me kind of like an overview of what happened to News Corp during the 2010s?
Yeah, it was, I would say, probably the most challenging time of all for the organisation. Not just here in Australia, but globally. So you sort of started the decade with Lachlan Murdoch being on the outer. He'd sort of surprised everyone from walking away and was doing his own thing. So he then kind of came back to Australia and eventually ended up buying what's now the Nova Entertainment radio network from DMG, and making a big success of it. So that's become something quite profitable for him in his own right, but also much less successfully investing in Network 10 alongside James Packer, and eventually losing their entire stake on that one after they misplayed their hands, and the organisation fell into the hands of what's now Viacom CBS instead. But you then saw sort of Lachlan come back within the fold. In the meantime, things have changed an awful lot. We've gone from John Hartigan at the helm to a very brief and tumultuous time where Kim Williams ran the organisation, and he came in with this brief to really get it ready for digital disruption and remake the internal structures, and ended up really going to war with the editors as a result. And in the end, Rupert Murdoch backed the editors rather than Williams. So there was all of that sort of tumult going on. At the same time, you had in Australia the scandal over Melbourne Storm, and there was really questionable behaviour over the salary caps. And at the time, of course, News Corp was the owner of Melbourne Storm. So that sort of played into their NRL ambitions, which are really important on the Foxtel side of things. And then you had other local difficulties like Bruce Guthrie, former editor of the Herald Sun, successfully suing over his dismissal. And then perhaps the biggest blow of all globally, and it did feed into the kind of I guess the mojo of the organisation in Australia as well, was the phone hacking scandal with the News of the World, which Rupert Murdoch eventually took the decision to close to save wider ambitions for the company. But it was a huge humiliation and a sign of, I guess, that there were weaknesses within News Corp as well. So if you look back a decade, there was a real moment where it felt that News Corp was not the organisation that it once was, and that Rupert Murdoch was not the leader that he'd once been.
So what happens there? From what you're describing is a institution that is on the downward turn, is losing its cultural impact, to where we are today, which is basically seeing it as, as many people describe it, the most influential news media organization in the world, or at least the Western world.
Yeah, and a number of things. I suppose a key thing is it just stuck at it and slugged it out, which is something that Rupert Murdoch often has done over the years. So it doggedly went about its business, which some of it was remaking business structures and just beginning to sort of, I guess, to that kind of level of acceptance that being a media owner was not going to be as straightforwardly profitable and as easily profitable as it once was, that running newspapers was just going to get harder because the model had changed. There wasn't as much kind of classified advertising money, for one thing, coming in. So that was a part of it. So there has been this story of just a a constant sort of dogged remaking of the business model. And some of that, of course, means that there are a lot fewer staff there as a result. So back in 2012, it wasn't announced at the time, but it was a significant number of staff who had to leave the organisation. It was about 1 in 10 at the time. So about the same time that Fairfax were making 1,900 people redundant, News Corp was making about 1,600 people redundant. So it was, it was a really big number. And then, of course, we saw the drama of the kind of Kim Williams short leadership become a caretaker role from Julian Clark as a CEO for a couple of years, and then Michael Miller come back to the organisation. He'd briefly gone away to run APN News and Media, and then a kind of steadying of the ship, not just under him, but one or two other kind of key sort of executives on the commercial side who just reworked the model to the extent that they dragged the newspapers, certainly in normal years, back into something approaching profitability.
Lachlan Murdoch is someone who you write about a bit in the book. And he, as you said before, was on the outer and now looks like he's in pole position. What do you think that we can look at from what he did in the Australian media market over the last decade? And what do you think that tells us about how he might be as a leader going forward?
Yeah, Lachlan is a fascinating character because, of course, if you were to look back at even further back, he had the sort of debacle of OneTel, the big telco investment, which burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. And again, that was a joint investment with James Packer, where if you weren't a Murdoch, that would probably be the end of your media career. But he absolutely proved that he got some media savvy just with the investment in Nova Entertainment. That has become a very profitable radio network, of which there can't be anyone but Lachlan and the people that he appointed who deserve the credit for that. It's absolutely them. But at the same time, 10 and the investment in 10 was a real misjudgment in the way that he let that one slip through his fingers, and it cost him a lot of money at the same time. So I suppose what we see there is a willingness to make a few moves, and he's done it in the past within News Corp as well. So again, he was the one who led a very savvy investment in REA, the real estate group, very early on, which in the end became probably as important as anything to the future of News Corp as it stands now. So if you look at the sort of the profitability of News Corp as an organisation globally, the biggest single contributor is the digital real estate services now. So that is another place where perhaps he deserves a bit more credit than he's necessarily been given. But I suppose the other thing to be careful around sort of Lachlan is this assumption that he's the natural successor because he's the sibling who's there within the organisation, because there is this sort of complicated family trust within the Murdoch family, which decides the leadership at the moment. So Rupert has 4 votes, and then the 4 adult children, so Lachlan, James, Elizabeth, and Prudence, have the other 4 votes. But when Rupert's not on the scene anymore, his 4 votes vanish. So you then have Lachlan, I think most people see as broadly sharing his father's politics, but the other 3 siblings, not necessarily. So just because he might at that point be sitting at the helm of the organisation, in the end, the voting shareholders decide, not the CEO. So there may yet be some quite big questions when succession time comes along.
So let's ask about succession then in just a moment, because you've kind of given that that into us. Is Lachlan based on any particular character in that? How realistic do you think a show like that is compared to your understanding of the way the family works?
Hey, look, I think in terms of the incidents and the dynamics, Succession is, I mean, what an absolutely brilliant show it is, but it draws on so many kind of incidents and moments incredibly well, and you see one of the siblings trying to invest in kind of record labels and that sort of thing. Of course, James had done earlier in his career. You see, members of the family being on the outer and then back inside. I suppose the one thing is, I've only briefly met James a handful of times, Lachlan just the once. They are actually incredibly polite to the little people. So that's the one, I suppose, disappointing thing compared to the kind of the kind of incredibly arrogant arseholes of Succession is they've been very well brought up by I suspect by their mother in particular. So it doesn't make for great script writing, does it? But that's probably the one thing I suspect in personality types there isn't an awful lot to compare between the two.
You never know. Maybe they're a bit different behind closed doors. Tim, I think probably final question is, I want you to look into your crystal ball, and I know people hate doing this, but we love to put people on the spot. What do you think a post-Rupert News Corp looks like in 5 years?
Well, I think the first thing is to challenge on that assumption is that Rupert won't be around in 5 years because, of course, although it's not that long ago since he celebrated his 90th birthday, his mother was still going strong, well into being a centenarian. But I think at some point, the big question, I think, will be whether the organisation holds together as one organisation. Let's remember about 8 years ago, the company split when 21st Century Fox and News Corp became two separate organisations. And then, of course, 21st Century Fox split again with most of its assets ending up with Disney and Rupert Murdoch as one of the biggest shareholders in Disney, whilst also creating Fox Corporation as well. So I suspect that one of the answers would be further splits. We already see the rumblings about Foxtel, which News Corp owns 2/3 of, perhaps floating on the stock exchange in its own right. You might well see the Fox News assets in the US go in one direction and the newspapers in another. So I suppose the thing that would most surprise me in 5 years' time would be if the structure of News Corp as it stands now is the same. I think much more likely it will be different.
All right. Tim, I think that's everything. Thank you so much for your time. Great
Not
insights.
at all. An absolute pleasure.
And it was a real pleasure. Yeah. And like I said before, I highly recommend subscribing to the newsletter. I haven't had a chance to read the full book yet, but I'm going to get it on my Kindle. It does. And I've listened to some of the audio. We have a very lovely speaking voice, by the way, and your audio book is very entertaining.
You are very kind.
That was Tim Burrowes, founder of Mumbrella, author of Media Unmade, Australia's most disruptive decade. He also runs a media newsletter, which is Unmade. You can subscribe to that for free at unmade.media. It's really worth listening to.
That is it for us this week. Thank you all for listening, as always. It's been great. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. Also, if you can, we would love to get some reviews on there so that anyone who's clicked on it and is like, I don't know if I want to listen to this, you can put in a good word for us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just about anywhere. And a reminder that you can join our podcast group on Facebook at it's called Murdocracy Podcast. There's a nice little community there. We share stuff throughout the week. It's fun to keep the conversation going. And just a reminder, our Patreon is Patreon, patreon.com/Murdocracy, MURDOCRACY. Thank you to Natalie Sekalovska, our producer, Kevin McLeod for the theme music, the ABC for the recordings from the archive that's in that, Ruby Innes for our artwork, and of course, as always, thank you to you, Sammy.
Thank you very much, Cam.
Bye.
Bye.